Hello, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural episode of George Can Learn. This is definitely our first time recording this. And, in a second, I'll introduce our amazing first guest on the program. But after this conversation, we'll be having a Q&A with a good old Techstars colleague of mine, Adam Beal. He'll be talking about fundraising, his experience fundraising, some alternative forms of fundraising that exist out there in the ether, out in the universe. But right now, in this universe, in the universe that we're talking about right now, I have one of the greatest therapists to come out of Hawaii, a clinical researcher, a seasoned sales leader, a rising startup founder, a badass tech hippie, and my good remote friend, founder and CEO of Kilo, Amanda Bender.
Thanks, George.
You certainly deserve all that round of applause. You've had so many experiences throughout your life, but I think a new recent experience of yours I'd like to tee up and really discuss about, because it's so interesting to me as someone who's born and raised in Boston, kind of traveled around, on a little bit of vacationing, but, hasn't really transplanted themselves in other places to the extent that you have. I'd really love for you to kind of talk about, kind of the journeys that you've taken throughout your life, and how that's kind of led you to be a digital nomad now.
Yeah. So I'm really happy to have this chat with you. Thank you for having me as the inaugural guest. So yes, I recently started my first phase of being a nomad, a full-time digital nomad. And I'll start with where I currently am, and then I'll take the listeners and watchers back to how I got to this point, because I think if anyone listening has a feeling in their gut they want to be a nomad or want to take some time to explore and work remotely, I'll share how I did it. It's just my story. So currently I'm living at a beautiful lake in the country of Guatemala, which reminds me a lot of Hawaii. Which is where I was born. So here at the lake, there are beautiful ancient dormant volcanoes, there are plumeria trees, bougainvillea, birds like I've never seen, and magical sunrises and sunsets, which are very important to me because they remind me just that every day something new can happen, very good for my mental health. And at night, there's a sky full of bright twinkling stars, which is really amazing. And during this chaotic time and this wretched time in the world, I can really breathe here and be surrounded by beauty. So how did I actually get here? Let's briefly chat about that for a moment. You and I met during, it's almost 2 years ago, I realized. And so that would have been 2020. So my remote work experience started 4 years before that in 2016. And I was working full-time for an early stage ed tech company. And I took a trip to Kauai for some vacation. It's not an island that I grew up on. And I spent a week there. I fell in love with the energy of the island. And on the flight back to what we call the mainland, to California, I was living at the time, I concocted a plan on how I'd be able to put together a presentation and pitch to the CFO and the CEO on how I could actually save the company money if I worked remotely in Hawaii. And Hawaii was also part of my sales territory at the time. So I did that. I put together a presentation. I shared how I would save the company money working remotely. I presented it to first my boss, and then he gave me the thumbs up, and then I talked to the CFO and the CEO. And that kicked off my first remote work experience. That 1 month turned into 5 months working remotely, and I realized that I wanted that to be a way of life. So then when I was looking for my next job, I wanted to have a fully remote work role. So in 2017, I made the jump to another company that was fully remote. And during that time, I was able to travel and live on Kauai a couple other times. And then last year, I think I have a history of doing this, George. 1 week in Mexico turned into 7 months. And I was able to work remotely there at my full-time job, as well as my full-time job as, at that time, the solo founder of Kilo, which I can talk a bit more about in a moment. But Yeah, so I ended up living in Mexico for 7 months. I realized that I could work what I now call the slow productive life. So not everyone has access to 20 Mbps internet, but I was still able to get Kilo's first version of the app on the App Store. I was still able to work with PMs and have daily stand-ups and also live every day like part vacation and part like founder and contributor to society.
I love that. I love that. And, I think it's kind of topical for us to be talking about this kind of digital nomad style,
Hmm.
especially with companies like Airbnb, kind of embracing it. I'd love to talk to you about, like, what do you think is, the future of remote work? Some people say it's hybrid. Some people say you got to be in the office because you got to meet everyone and all these type of things. And, I think there's such a range out there, right? What do you think is your opinion on that?
Hmm. I think at the core, it really depends on the person. For me, I'm an introvert and I'm an only child. And I find that when I have a lot of alone time to work, I'm, I execute very well. So when I worked as a director of sales for a company that was fully remote, I found that I was still able to manage my team well by creating a lot of community through virtual chats that we did and checking in with my team. We used WhatsApp once in a while to communicate as well. But I don't think it's for everybody. I have friends that work in the tech space who really enjoy going to an office and going on hikes sometimes with coworkers or going out for a drink or dinner. And that is how they thrive. That's where they are in more of their flow state or creative state. And for me, I find that in a lot of ways, the world is made for extroverts. Like it's quite loud and people are expected to be super outgoing and team meetings or like offsites if they come together. And sometimes it's really overwhelming for me as an introvert because I actually like deplete my introvert batteries when I'm around a lot of people. And so I think that giving employees options, or if you are a listener and you're thinking of starting your own company, like really recognizing first how you work best and then being sure that the team that you build, that you ask each person, like, do you prefer hybrid? Like Kilo probably will never have an office. Like my co-founder and I, Shay Clark, really love working remotely, but we met in person, and we met face to face. But she lives in Los Angeles and I live here in Guatemala. So we've talked a lot about how we best work. And recognizing that because we can't expect that every person who comes on board to Kilo wants to work remotely. I mean, we hope that they do because that's the model that we have. But we also think it's important to get together probably at least twice a year because there is something that happens. We were talking about this before we started the podcast. Is there something that happens when you meet someone? There's a different energy exchange. I think oxytocin may be released in a different way. That's a hypothesis, not like, I haven't done any research on that yet. But something definitely transpires, I think, neurochemically and in our body sensation, like in our bodily sensations that doesn't happen through this tiny circle on our laptops.
Yeah. And I think, we've had a lot of different chats throughout, the pandemic and, even more recently, just as friends, right, talking about each other's startups and what's going on in our lives. And I think one of the things that I found really impressive, right, that maybe some entrepreneurs haven't really come around to doing and, haven't really, thought about doing, right, is really looking inward and seeing what type of business they want to build
Mm-hmm.
and, the business that's right for them, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
think I'd love to kind of, ask you to give, maybe a small little thing about Kilo, right? The a massive impact, the work that you're doing, and how you pivoted your business from where it was at the start to where it is now. And I think
Mm-hmm.
now, I think you've really hit this great point with you and your business partner, uh, building something that you two are absolutely passionate about.
Yeah. So Kilo is a content-driven app to help men explore their feelings using bite-sized audio content. So a user checks in with his mood and then his focus, and then we deliver a daily mix of content. Some of that content is curated by Kilo. Some of it is from podcasts, from awesome content people we're working with. And then we're actually also allowing the community to record their own insights and share them within Kilo. So kind of like social media, but for mental health, or like Spotify for mental health, because there isn't anything out there. When I first started Kilo, I had the idea for Kilo in 2019, and I was once a therapist and I worked in neuroscience research at a university for many years and made the jump to technology. Gosh, I think it's been over 7 years now. So creating a mental health app just feels like just such a wonderful marriage of all of my skills. And anyway, when I got the idea in 2019, it was more for mood tracking. And along with that mood tracking data, we would then give users a written insight that would hopefully, neutralize thinking, be an encouragement, teach a user something more about emotional intelligence. And I worked on that for about 2 years. That specific concept, was able to get it built, push it out on the App Store as a solo founder at the time. And Shay, my business partner, was writing the content. She's really creative and she was giving Kilo this entertaining, fun voice. And I think for men, that's really important, especially when talking about emotions. And so we sat down at the end of last year and I was like, okay, we have all this feedback. What are we going to do? And I had read this book by Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett called How Emotions Are Made. And she proposes a new theory of emotion, how we can architect our own emotional reality by doing a few things. I would check out her book if you're interested in learning about those few things. We've also based the pivot of the app on this new theory. And so I said to Shay, like, I want to focus the app on this theory of constructed emotion. And she's like, hell yeah. She's like, I have this really great brand of monsters. And I was like, yeah. So the monsters are based on kind of like Japanese B-movie colors and faces. And we have one monster named Guarg, and they represent like happy, crappy, and okay. And we want men to be able to own their feelings at some point. We're thinking about working on an NFT project and building community around that. But the pivot was really important because in our minds, mood tracking is helpful, but we think in order for people to make behavioral changes, like content is super important. And we're doing this, we're creating a piece of content for you as you're learning and a piece of content for me too to share. And I think as people become more curious, especially during this time where a lot of people are still working from home, listening to content is really important. It's taught me a lot about how to be a founder. I've learned about technical things. As a founder, I've learned more about emotional research and music and lots and lots and lots of things.
And Bender, I know that in previous conversations we've had just between you and me, you've talked a lot about how, different you and Shay are, right? And as you two have come together, you have a particular set of skills. She has a particular set of skills. I think the two of you really complement each other. And I'd really love to learn about your process, just being co-founders, learning from each other and trying to improve and be better and grow as founders and growing your business as well. Love to hear about your process from learning from each other.
Yeah, I like this question because sometimes people are on a co-founder search and they're meeting strangers. Sorry, there's a saw in the background for listeners, by the way. Doing some building
Someone
next
is
door.
actually legitimately building the app right now. So
Yeah, yeah, with a chainsaw next door.
someone's building.
Shay and I met at a powerlifting gym in Los Angeles, so we already had something in common. And when I pitched the idea for Kilo to her, I had said, like, I want Justin Bieber to be on this app someday, because around that time he was talking a lot about his addictions and using hyperbaric chamber for healing and meditation. And she's like, I'm like, oh, I know that probably sounds crazy. She's like, that doesn't sound crazy to me. I was like, we're gonna be friends. And something Shay and I do on a regular basis is give each other the opportunity to share when we're feeling scared about something or excited about something. We recently applied to be on Esther Perel's podcast called, I think, How We Work. And as Shay and I were going through the application, we worked through something that came up for us. We had a break in our relationship in the past when she was writing content for Kilo. And a year later, we reconnected. And after that break happened, I realized that our relationship was strengthened. And I no longer had a fear that I could lose my friend, because I lost my friend for a year, so to say. I mean, I knew where she went. I didn't really lose her, but we lost touch for a year, and I wasn't sure if we were going to talk again. And it was a really, really difficult time for me. And when we reconnected and she started working for Kilo, and then when she proposed being a co-founder, everything in me was like, this is a relationship where there was a break and we were able to heal and be stronger. I think that's quite difficult for people, even in a co-founder relationship. Like when they have some turmoil, in my experience, a lot of people try to push things under the rug, or they don't say to another person, like, I know you really like that person we had a call with, but like, here are my feelings. And the other person isn't really able to hear out the partner and just honestly shut the F up for a little bit and really give the other person the space to be heard. And I think that is something Shay and I have. I don't know how you teach it. If I could bottle that, I would. But I think it's about, and going back to Kilo, it's about learning how to actively listen and working on emotional intelligence. Because as I mentioned earlier, I am an introvert. And so oftentimes I'm thinking about how could I better support people, but I'm doing it alone. And I'm not necessarily having tons of conversations with people to kind of reality check what I'm thinking about. So I've opened myself up a lot and been quite vulnerable in my relationship with Shay, saying I'm feeling scared about this, or I'm stressed about this. Can we take a break? Or I'm really excited about this. Let's share it. And that's a beautiful thing.
And I think that's super important, right? Like the point of this podcast, right, was me coming to a point in my career being like, I'm done with a couple of startups. I had some decent early success, right? But life is long and I should really be investing in learning from a lot of people, right? And you've had the amazing opportunity to learn from so many different experiences in your life, your co-founder, right? And, now I'm just kind of sharing the knowledge as I'm learning from people. I'd really love to talk to you, as an adult, and now I have to do adult things, and I have to transition away from, being 3 to 4 years removed away from college now, right? How to transition from being kind of that linear 9 to 5 student that schools kind of push you into becoming, and becoming a dynamic adult student. Like, how does one become that?
Yeah. I think one becomes that by continuing to be curious and allowing your curiosity to be bigger than your ego. I think sometimes people think they've learned what they've needed to learn in undergraduate, university, or graduate school, or right after their first job, but it's ongoing. And I'm in my early 40s and I continue to learn things all the time. Like, for example, in the last few months, I've been learning about this concept called the Yamamara. And earlier this year, I read a book by a Buddhist nun named Pema Chodron called When Things Fall Apart. A friend here at the lake had it just coincidentally resting on his coffee table. And I had heard about Pema Chodron from the therapist I was working with at the time, and also through a psychedelic integration group I was attending online. Like, people mentioned her name like 3 times in 2 months. So my ears perked up. And when I saw the book, I asked my friend if I could borrow it. And so there are 4 maras in Buddhism. And the maras are associated with Buddhist cosmology, which they talk about them as different forms of death, rebirth, and desire. So this specific mara, Yama Mara, is most closely associated to our fear of death. But really, Pema Chodron says it's actually more a fear of life, a fear of not breathing into a full and vibrant life. And that plays into a couple things. Like, I've been so curious about this. It's really been driving my nomadic lifestyle. And the last place I lived in for 6.5 years in one house. And that's actually the longest I'd ever lived in one place. I grew up with a single mom. That's a story for maybe a follow-up podcast on not having everything given to you, but still being able to be successful in your life and finding your flow and path. But I realized that putting myself in uncomfortable situations would actually help me not only grow as a human, but would also benefit Kilo and the success of Kilo as well. So staying curious, I think, is really important in terms of being the best adult student. I also think asking questions of other people. So I find that, and this is a pet peeve of mine, so hopefully this will be helpful for listeners. And I think a lot of people have this pet peeve, but maybe they don't say it, is when I'm sharing when someone asks me a question and I share something with them and they just start talking about themselves, like, oh yeah, I did that too, and blah, 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 wah, 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 wah. I'm like, wait, but don't you want to know more? Like, isn't that the fun part of conversation, is about being curious about another human and learning about them? And so I'm not perfect. I don't always do this, but like, if you said something to me, I'd be like, oh my gosh, why do you like that? Why do you not like it? Tell me more about that. And that's really how we, I think, continue to learn beyond school, because we learn more from each other. Like in school, we're learning from like a professor, right? And then we're learning from books. And then, in my opinion, we're regurgitating the information. But when we're having conversation, I think it's like going to life school every day.
Wow, that's really profound, right? And I think, how our perspective on things, right, and how we can see the world. I think you've described it to me beforehand, right? Like of being this intellectually honest person, right, who is willing to set aside their ego and put forth, their will to like learn and grow and listen to other people and all that type of stuff. I absolutely love it. And I think that one of the big things that you connected that to was sales, right? And, you have a very strong background in sales. And I think, your kind of life methodology and sales have kind of coalesced into this beautiful, boosting of one of your, superpowers, if you will, right? And, as someone who, in the early stages, you were basically talking to me in customer discovery about Kilo. I got to experience, right, firsthand, you during, albeit an early sales process, but a sales process nonetheless. I'd love to talk to you about like what your experience is, right, in communicating with other people and working on sales, how that worked for Kilo, and, what are some lessons that I can learn that I can carry forth and the audience can carry forth.
Yeah. Oh, sales. I love sales. I think a lot of people think they're not good at sales, but really what they're not good at is figuring out what the hook is in what they're selling or what they're passionate about or what their company's about. And then I went through many iterations with Kilo. I'm like, what's the core hook? What's the core driver? Like that gets people excited? What connects to people's emotions? So I'm actually going to start there. With sales, I think one of the most important things, well, before connecting to emotion, is like listening to the potential customer, willing to do cold outreach and be a cheerleader for whatever you're working on. And I said a couple things there, so let me go back. We're going to cut that. Just leave it for a few seconds because I got actually out of order of what I wanted to say in my own thing. Yeah, I think the saw got to me. Okay. So with sales, there's a few things I think that are really important. And what I learned actually from working in sales at a couple tech companies, and actually before that, when I was a therapist, I had to market myself and sell what I was doing to the community. And it's really important to figure out what the emotional driver is for you and for the product that you're selling, whether it's for a company or your own company, whether you're a coach, a tech founder, you own a bakery, uh, whatever it may be, is figuring out what that emotional driver is. And the other thing is actively listening to customers. So I find that a lot of people in sales don't do a good enough job of really listening to the person on the other end of the call. And I'm going to say this a lot. I think just in years to come, if more people have me on their podcast, it's like active listening is something I've been talking about for years because it's a skill. It's a skill that people can learn. So when a potential customer gets on a call, instead of me talking at the person about Kilo for 20 minutes, I ask a lot of questions first to understand, like, where's the guy at? What problems is he having? Like, is he feeling unwell, depressed, or anxious? And how can Kilo potentially help him? And not every person is going to be a customer, but I think if we actively listen to people, that person may not be a customer, but they can spread the word. And then there's like the power of referrals and sales. The other thing I was going to say is to be bold in talking about whatever your product is. Again, whether you're a tech founder or you're working for a company. So last year, once Kilo version 1 was pushed to the App Store, I'd be walking around the streets of Los Angeles, whether I was at coffee shops or restaurants, and I would spy a group of guys sitting together, which was already so awesome to me, like having good conversation, getting along with each other. And I'd walk up and be like, hi, I'm working on a mental health app for men. Would you be willing to try it out? And they'd kind of look at me like, who is this lady? But 99% of the time, people are like, okay, tell me more. I didn't like give them the whole spiel and then ask if they would try it out. I asked them one simple question first. So they could take a moment, they could ingest those couple words that I shared and then make a decision. And then I'd be like, all right, like, here's the code, here's how you can download it. But I think sometimes people get a little bit too nervous to do that, and you really gotta like be a cheerleader.
A little side detour, if you don't mind. I'd like to ask you, so there was this thing that I always thought about with sales and a lot of different skills that are within entrepreneurship. It feels as if for founders and a lot of people who are working in the startup space, we don't usually practice a lot of the things that we do, right? And in any other profession, right, whether you're coding and you have to keep up with your skills, so you gotta exercise that muscle, right? And literally exercising muscles in athletics, right? You gotta shoot hoops to be able to get good. In basketball, right? You gotta throw as a quarterback. You can't just be content and just roll up to the game and I'm gonna be good to go, right? I often wonder in the analogy, right? If we're talking about like a basketball or a sports analogy and transferring that into startups, I wonder if people need to sometimes practice their, quote unquote office skills, right? And stuff that they need to do in order to do their work. If someone needs to be practicing, if I think I'm not good at sales, then I should be taking some reps at, doing sales activities.
Yes. I like this idea of reps. So when I worked at the first tech company, the boss that I had so we had to stand up every day for 15 minutes. We were a small team of 4 people. And at the start of every meeting, he'd be like, all right, we're going to practice our sales pitch. And everyone would go around and we'd give contacts. We say like, okay, you're at a conference, and what's the first question you ask? And we worked on Chromebooks. So we give the pitch, and then people would give honesty that like, no, like start again, and sometimes halfway through, my boss would be like, like, okay, go again, until it became second nature. I mean, it took us months till we got our 30-second pitch down. And something I'm realizing now more than ever is that we really had to trust each other and throw judgment to the wayside and truly believe that our boss had our best interest in mind, was to help make us the best salespeople so that we could have a successful company and everyone wins, right? And the customer is happy. That's part of the big winning as well, because the customer is clear on what we're selling and we're not wasting their time. So we did many, many, many reps. When I went to the second company I worked for, I tried to impart the same practice, and it was quite difficult. The company was larger than the previous company when I joined. And people are like, oh, I don't want to say it again. I'm like, but that's the point, until it becomes automatic. And really, you could say it to a 10-year-old or a 90-year-old, and it would be the same information that's conveyed clearly, concisely, and with emotional impact. Then you don't have a sales pitch yet. So I think sales teams need to work on that, as well as like C-suite people. Sometimes when Shay and I talk about like meetings with investors, and eventually I think about meetings with board members when we get there, is practicing not only our emotional connection to what we want to share in the meeting, but making sure that we're delivering value for the people on the other end as well, like the people in the board meeting or whomever we're speaking to, because everyone's time is really valuable. And pitching a really good tight pitch, again, that connects to an emotional driver, is like a really nice fresh of breath of fresh air.
And I think like, there's so much education about how to do your pitch, right? And it almost becomes kind of like a soft business prayer, a fight song at a school. Like someone just learns it for the sake of doing it and getting it over with and getting it done. And I wonder if like the ability to do it organically, right? That skill just transfers from sales to pitching to, trying to seek investment, customer discovery. I think that all these skills are just comparable. You just need to work at it and get better at it. What would be some, you talked about like being on a hot seat and having people, run through that type of stuff. So that's kind of like one exercise. Are there any others? I think like for a lot of people, and even myself, right, it's kind of and I think it might be extending back to like ego, right? The fact that you feel ashamed even in like your own house in the privacy to like stare at a mirror and like just give a sales pitch, right? And just watching yourself as you do it, right? Something so cliche and cheesy, right? I don't know if like that's something that you need to do, or maybe there's something that's a little bit easier, a little bit more, easier on the nerves, easier on, not bruising people's egos.
Well, I mean, we don't need it to be easier. We need it to be impactful. And in order to get to impactful, we have to do the things that feel uncomfortable a lot of times. So I like this idea of practicing in front of a mirror. What I find really helpful, like I recently signed up to be part of, this is a new thing to me, like accelerator for giving a TED talk, or a TEDx talk rather. And so I've been recording myself using photo booth on my laptop, giving my speech. And even if I mess up, I'll keep going. If I mess up in the middle, or like I burp or something, or there's a saw in the background, just keep going. And then I watch it, and then I do it again. And then I watch it, and I do it again. And I watch it, and I do it again. And I'm going to keep saying that, like, watch it, do it again, until the point I'm like, this is a tight, good talk. And I'm not there yet. And I actually learned this when I was in graduate school for clinical psychology. Something we had to do at the end of every semester was transcribe sessions with our clients. So literally I'd have to write like George and then what you said word for word, and then Amanda, what I said. And it got me into a practice of really listening to what I was saying. And now with technology, I mean, thankfully I don't have to write out, I don't have to just transcribe things anymore. It was tedious, but now I can create a video and watch it myself. And yes, I'm like cringy and I think, oh, I said there, or I said like, or I did this clicking thing sometimes I do with my mouth. But the only way to recognize those things is to watch yourself and correct yourself.
I often think that, your biggest impact on me, right, is changing how I think about my interpersonal performance, right? And thinking about evaluating myself and being hard on myself in, social situations, but also from a mental health perspective, right? And obviously with what you're doing at Kilo, right? I think like it's just like where I am, what I'm doing, right? Whether it's sales, whether it's marketing, whether it's everything else, there's a quantifiable score that we give for each one of those things, right? But if something's quantifiable, that means that I can put in the reps, I can put in the work to improve myself and actually see progress in being able to do so, right? And I think it's so great in what you're saying, right? To kind of put away the ego, be willing to do the cringy stuff, be willing to put in the work, because if you want to succeed, you gotta do it, right? So that's awesome. That's awesome. When you were doing sales and working at larger organizations, right? You were part of like bigger teams, right? And managing bigger teams and working with a bunch of people, hiring, firing, all that type of stuff. I'd like to see, you're probably not in the position to do so right now for Kilo, but in the future, when do you think is like a good natural point where you would flip from having kind of founder led sales into hiring on a VP of sales and, your first, account executives and so on and so forth?
I think it's important to have happy customers who are starting to refer other customers. So it's at the point when it's tipped from fully outbound sales to from cold calling to inbound warm leads. Because then I believe a sales organization actually has a pipeline to generate enough sales and enough calls, like has enough of a funnel to bring on a team.
Hmm.
I have seen quite a few sales organizations hire AEs thinking, well, we see that there's untapped markets in the West Coast or the central US, because really we only have a team focused on maybe the West Coast, for example. And they don't have the inbound leads. They aren't getting referrals from their current customers. And so it just makes me wonder, like, why do you think just having some humans behind a computer selling or in a seat selling is all of a sudden going to start generating more business? But I think quite a few sales organizations maybe have thought that way or do think that way. I see it from a different perspective. I see that if there are warm inbound leads coming in and customers are talking about you, whether it's online and social media or at conferences or referring people to your business, that's a really good sign that you need some salespeople and you need some structure around going out and having more of those conversations, or spending more time on call with customers to increase referrals, or making sure that the inbound warm leads are getting calls scheduled within a timely way, like within a few hours if an email comes in, and making sure that the follow-up time between the first call and the follow-along calls to get the sale or to have someone subscribe, for example, is shorter because there is a larger team, if that makes sense.
That's super fascinating because, like, I think for even me, and how I've thought about this, I've usually viewed sales as being, the founder doesn't want to do cold calling anymore because, that just sucks. I don't want to do that anymore. I'm just going to hire on a VP of sales whom loves talking with people on the phone all the time. So they're going to go out and cold call everyone for me. I don't have to do it. But what you're saying, and if I'm hearing you right, basically what you're saying is that there are already people who want to be your customers. They just need to figure out how to get there, and that your sales folks are kind of shepherding people along, right? They're more, your crossing guard than, an escort, right, if you will. Like going out and finding, stuff and kind of moving people through around, right? And instead being like, oh, you already wanted to go in this direction. Here, let me make it super easy for you, right?
Yes, and I will say this. When I first started in tech, there was a team of, I think, 2 salespeople because the CEOs were building the actual product. They were engineers, or are engineers rather. So they needed a couple of people to be on the phone and cold call schools. But they didn't grow that team until they had a couple of big sales, and those schools were talking about the product at conferences. So when I came on a week after they hired a VP of sales. And so he and I worked together on really tapping into the customer base they already had, which was probably just half a dozen schools. But we talked to them like, what's working, what's not working. And so when we went to conferences, because people were meeting in person at the time, then we're like, look, we've changed this. We work with this school. This school has said XYZ about our product. And they're like, oh, yeah, we already were thinking about going in that direction. So like you said, more like a crossing guard, like come this way. We have a product that could help you. The other thing with growing a sales team is to make sure that you're not pitching to people that aren't going to be customers, and being okay with people not being your customer, not trying to convince them, because salespeople could spend their time actually more wisely talking to someone that actually really has a pain point that their product could solve.
That's really great advice, I think. I'd love to also talk with you, seeing the gap between when you first create that team and some of the bigger organizations. I'm sure you've had a lot of thoughts as you working, as we've all had, right, working in a corporate environment where we're just like, gosh, I wish, when it's grown to be this big, I would rather do it this way. And I'd love to talk about, for your perspective, right, when, we've talked about first starting that sales team and when to do it. When you're wanting to grow and scale that sales team into a formal department, let's say, how would you best, and let's get tactical here, get into, building out, hey, these are where this heads, we're going to organize these teams, we're going to organize this, branch or whatever, right? I don't want to pin you into a corner, but how would you, organize, grow, and scale, a whole sales organization?
Yeah. So I think it's really important to take care of the people who are like the first boots on the ground, so to say, flip-flops on the ground, whatever, in the organization, to ask those people, what are your thoughts? How can we divide up territories? How can we grow the sales team? What type of team do you want to work with? Do you want to work in pods? And what I mean by that is, do you want us to also flesh out the customer success team? So you have, one customer success person, one salesperson. If you have implementation on your product, or you have like subscription management, whatever it may be, like, do people want to be in pods? Do they want to work alone, but they want support in a different way? I think sometimes as organizations grow, they forget to ask the opinions of the people doing the actual job, and they only ask the managers or the VPs. And the managers and the VPs are doing a good job managing the people doing the work, but the people doing the work usually know best on like how they want to scale. Now, sometimes territories get divvied up and salespeople are like, oh man, I'm losing like that part, kind of bummed about it. But if organizations can do it in a way where they're giving a voice to the people actually doing the jobs, I found that scaling works really, really well, because territories are going to continue to be cut in half or in quarters as a company grows. If the company is becoming successful, that's inevitable. But I think where things kind of go awry, I think this is an important point, is when the actual people doing the selling don't feel heard. The other thing I'll say is, in terms of scaling to a more formal team, is making sure that the managers, because salespeople usually are pretty extroverted and they like to talk and they want to know what's going on, is making sure that if an organization is bringing in VPs or chief revenue officers or sales directors of some sort, is to make sure that the team members who are going to be managed by that person get to interview that person. I think that sounds really like a no-brainer, but I've seen a lot of organizations miss that step, and it's been detrimental to the growth of their sales team.
I think one of the biggest takeaways that I've taken from this podcast that we're doing, a lot of conversations that we've had, is just don't take shortcuts, right? In what you're saying, right? And talk to people, listen, be a good listener, take the time, right? I think for a lot of founders, everybody feels like their hair's on fire, so we need to move at 1,000 miles an hour. And I think sometimes taking a good time out, being diligent, listening, going through the process, not just for the fact, not for the sake of like going through the motions, but legitimately, going through, not taking any shortcuts and getting things done. And speaking of things that are done, Bender, this podcast episode, this awesome conversation with you has come to its close. I'd love to, give you an opportunity to, give a shout out to what you've been doing, and, where can people find you and how can they support the amazing work that you're doing at Kilo.app?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to share a give. If anyone listening or watching wants some feedback on their sales pitch, hit me up on LinkedIn, Amanda Bender. I don't really use social media. Or you can send me a message on Kilo's website, which is www.kilo.app. I'm really happy to do that for people, to spend 15 minutes, as long as they have their pitch put together and actually want feedback on something. I really like doing that, and it's to the world. So Kilo has just wrapped up its prototype testing. And so we're going on to build the beta. If you want to check out how we can help you explore your feelings, again, it's www.kilo.app. You can send some love there and sign up to test the beta, as well as get the Tuesday Tap-In newsletter. I'm really grateful for our friendship, George, and how it's grown over the last almost 2 years virtually. And I'm happy that you want to learn more. It's a really great quality that you have.
Well, thank you, Bender. I mean, honestly, if you had told me that there was going to be this worldwide pandemic and I was going to meet one of my good friends, in life during the pandemic, and just having never met this person, in person, and just have just such a great close connection, I'm truly honored to be your friend, and it's been such an awesome time having a bunch of different conversations with you. I hope a lot of people will learn a lot from this. Thank you so much for being on the show, and I'm sure we'll have a lot more opportunities in the future to have some awesome conversations. Audience, stick around because we're going to have a Q&A with Adam Beal talking about fundraising after this episode. But this concludes this portion. Thank you for watching, and always remember, if George can learn, so can you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, so Awayr AI is a dual-use startup. We started in Cambridge, Mass. And so we've been building solutions for both aerospace and automotive since we began. And we've got a variety of offerings and different types of contract work that we've done. But in a general sense, what we do is we focus on machine learning, kind of high fidelity data about driver or user interaction. And we use that data to power next generation artificial intelligence and to build predictive tools for design.
Awesome. Awesome. And I know that you've, gone out, raised some money from a bunch of different investors and that type of stuff. And I thought that would have been a really great part to start on. As we start this podcast series, as we start going through and helping, both for me to learn a lot about like the fundraising structure and learning from different entrepreneurs, listening to them and how their process of fundraising was. And hopefully, a lot of people will gain a lot out of it. Love to talk about your experience, having fundraised before. Love to hear your, past perspective on it.
Sure. Yeah. So when we founded the company, we were bootstrapped. There were some small kind of friends and family types of injection of capital, but nothing crazy. And we were doing SBIRs pretty much from the beginning of the company.
And do you want to elaborate on that real quick?
Yeah, sure. So initially we had the idea that perhaps we would just grow through SBIR, and to some degree that's how it turned out. But there's a major factor we weren't considering when we chose that path, and that is that your profit margin on SBIRs is very limited. And so while SBIR funding will help you build technology, it doesn't really lead to a whole lot of capital in the company. And so that can be difficult for trying to run operations or inject into product development that's not tied into what you're doing in SBIR.
And just wanted to double click real quick for folks who don't know, the SBIR, which is the Small Business Innovation Research Grants. I remember in previous discussions that we've had, that you were working a lot with the Air Force and Space Force SBIR programs. Love to hear, a little bit of your thoughts of, you were working in a phase 1, right? And I don't know if you've gone into the phase 2, phase 3 since, last we talked, but, maybe outline that structure a little bit for folks who don't know.
Yeah, for people that are new to SBIR, it's a program in the federal government that's basically designed to find innovations for problems that the federal government has, and to build the kind of domestic industrial base of small companies. And so in general, the pathway, especially with Department of Defense, when you're trying to advance in that process, you've got phase 1, 2, and 3. And there's some variability in what those dollar figures are, but in general, phase 1 is anywhere from 75,000 to 100,000, can be as much sometimes as 150, 200,000 out of phase 1. Phase 2 is typically between 750,000 to 1.5 million. And phase 3, there's really no limit. And phase 3 is a little bit of a misnomer. That's the common language that people use around that. But in phase 1 and 2, the projects are funded by the SBIR fund, because it is a fully funded program that has its own budget and kind of doles that out to the different federal agencies. In phase 3, you're transitioning from working on SBIR dollars to seeking a regular contract with the government. And so the structure of what you're doing and the price and scope can change dramatically in phase 3.
Awesome. And yeah, so SBIRs is one of the different forms of fundraising options that are out there available to founders, right? And I think a lot of founders, I think it's a lot about the culture, the hype around fundraising. It's what gets the headlines in media and different types of stuff like that. I mean, it's often a badge of honor for a lot of people. We're currently in a downturn, so, sometimes fundraising can be a little bit hairy nowadays. But, for a really new, fresh starting founder who's just coming in, they don't really know much about the landscape. What should that relationship with fundraising be for someone who, has an idea, they're rolling into, maybe this is a project, maybe we're going to make it real. What should that evaluation process of, like, when should we start fundraising?
Sure. I mean, that's going to be a little bit different for everybody. Having 100% ownership is more important to some than others. And the timing and terms can vary somewhat, but to be honest, I don't think founders should worry about it too much. Losing some percentage ownership of your company is probably really the least of your problems in the bigger picture. The biggest risk is really just always going out of business. If you run out of runway, run out of capital, It really doesn't matter if you own 100% because because it's not worth anything or it's not worth much. And so there's a lot of different considerations around fundraising, and the dynamic is fairly different depending on kind of what stage of development you're at. But in the early stages, especially, it's much less technocratic than later. You know, the farther along in development you get, especially when the company has some revenues, then it's you know, it's a little bit more technical how people are thinking about the value of the company and these types of things. But in the early stages, it pretty much really is just kind of your assessment of the market, the product or service you're trying to build, the team, just kind of market trends around that, ability to execute. So it's really more kind of like the character of the team, the market they're going in, and kind of the way that they're thinking about going after it. You know, does it make logical sense? Those things are a lot more important in the beginning.
Love to hear, you know, kind of your thought process from kind of that hardware, hard tech, deep tech kind of lens, right? What are those early stage steps that founders can do to put themselves in a position to raise that pre-seed round?
Sure. Yeah. So deep tech products can be really hard to fundraise for. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but some of the reasons are the same challenges with any other type of startup. And depending on what companies start with, you know, sometimes they have a product or have a demo right off the bat. Sometimes they have an idea, but they are pre-product. They might not even have an MVP or a demo yet. But I've found the more you're demoing and the less you're talking around what you want to do, the more traction you get. You can have a really great pitch. You could have a great idea. It could be a good market. You could have everything going for you, but people just, people are more drawn to demos, to things that are tangible, that they can touch, they can see. So the closer you can get to that, whatever stage you're at, it will help you, fundraise. But sometimes that's not possible. You know, you might be building a new nuclear reactor or whatever it might be. In the early stages, it may truly be cost prohibitive to even build a demo, or companies may be, you know, 100% bootstrap. So that may not be accessible to them in the beginning. But you still need to find some ways to increase the confidence of investors that, you know, the pathway you're going is viable and that it can survive and thrive. And so a couple other ways you can do that. You know, if you have indications of interest to purchase, so if it was a consumer product, you could do a dummy website and, you know, show that you had traffic and people did a click to buy and, you know, kind of things like that. If you're doing something like enterprise sales, you could get letters of intent, letters of support, and just anything else that you can use, especially third party, because, you know, while they might think you're trustworthy, anything that's third party that's not coming from your mouth is going to always be a little bit more, you know, verifiable and trustworthy. So if you can get those letters of intent, if you have patents, if you have third-party expert independent opinions about your tech or your approach, those things are all going to increase the value of what you're doing in the eyes of the investors.
Yeah, I think some of the things that I've seen from pitch decks, right, that I really love is like that concrete user story that someone's able to create, right? Whether there's a customer testimonial explaining like, hey, this is what this product's done and how it's helped me out. And, you know, or if it's a little bit earlier on, right, in like that nuclear example or like, you know, some form of hardware / deep tech where the product's not actually tangibly made, but being able to get like some buy-in from the user saying like, yes, if this thing was in my hand right now, I'd buy it and actually use it. And, you know, in some cases you might want to have, you know, a little bit of written proof, right, the LOI or some form of conditional contract to show that early traction. What are some alternate, you know, fundraising aspects? You know, obviously revenue is king, but, you know, beyond that, let's just say in businesses that are not able to be in a position to generate revenue, you know, what are some, you know, alternative fundraising sources that they can look at?
Great question. You know, I think kind of the macro trends in the market, I think they're not felt by every company that's fundraising across the board. You know, so for example, we're basically in the SaaS segment, and I think SaaS is a little bit more steady. There's just a lot of investment in SaaS companies, no matter what's going on in the market. Um, Also, I think, things with valuations and kind of bigger dollars for going into startups. I think you see more of that in kind of like Series A, Series B territory where companies are raising larger funds. So I would say that kind of pre-seed and seed markets, while I'm sure that they're affected by that too, I think they're a little bit more sheltered from those trends than other kind of later stage parts of the startup market. There's a really consequential thing that has changed in the last year or two that I don't really think the market has fully grasped how impactful it's going to be. But there have been some changes in laws around crowdfunding. And so crowdfunding platforms like WeFunder, Republic, Start Engine, they're going to become really competitive with venture investment. And comparing raising on those crowdfunding platforms to raising through venture is almost a whole nother podcast because there's a lot of pros and cons and trade-offs between them. But in a general sense, I think the what's exciting to me about that, and even though we're currently fundraising now, but I don't think we'll raise through a crowdfund platform now, but maybe at one of our later stages we will. But why I'm excited about them, I think there's some key differences that give them some interesting advantages, perhaps. For one, because you're able to advertise to non-accredited investors, you can raise through non-accredited investors now through the crowdfunding platforms. You're able to market your round through more traditional avenues like digital marketing, which is very powerful. Because trying to raise in the traditional sense through venture investors, it's a pretty manual process. It's mostly through meetings, and you're not really getting a whole lot of benefit of the leverage of digital tools and digital channels to do that. So that's one factor. And, it's just a different type of investor. And the marketing of products for crowdfunding fundraising, it's a lot more like traditional marketing, whereas raising from venture is very technocratic. And so it's just a different approach, but I think it's really going to open up the market, and it's really the first competition for venture capital that's existed in a long time. So I think that's going to be really impactful. In terms of other alternatives, companies can always find ways to bootstrap. They can do friends and family. They can try to raise through grants. But from my experience, most of those are not very tenable because usually the dollars available through those avenues are pretty limited. You can, unless you've got a rich uncle, you can go hit up family, or you can put away a little bit of your savings, but you're going to probably struggle to get more than maybe, 25,000 to 100,000. And while that's not nothing, you can't pay a whole lot of salaries with that, and you can't do a whole lot of product development with that. So that's pretty limited. I'd mentioned the shortcomings of SBIR. That can be a path because you do fund product development, but unless you can take that all the way to something like a phase 3 where you've got a sufficient enough revenue coming from that you have some cash left over that you can inject back into the business, it's really going to be hard to use that to fund anything other than kind of the SBIR route. The last point on this is that sometimes in a fundraise, you might start off with a certain target and you might have difficulty raising that target. Maybe it's a large round. Maybe you're trying to fully fund 18 months or fully fund taking a product to market. And sometimes you can raise that round, sometimes you can't. And the fallback position could be half of that. It could be a third. It could be even much less than that. But the main point is if you can fall back to a position where you can raise an amount and you can feasibly raise that, and if injecting that into the company in terms of product development or business development can get you to a better day, help you achieve some milestones, put you in a better position to raise, then even though that's not the ideal situation, it's not the worst way forward that you could choose.
Yeah, because I think I've heard it from a lot of different investors, right? They really like the pipe model. When you're talking about like those later stage, formal seed rounds, Series A, Series B, you have those numbers to really go on, right? As opposed to a lot of those pre-seed rounds where you're evaluating, the founder and the people, all that type of stuff. And so, I think a lot of times you kind of take a couple steps back and are able to evaluate, your business based off of what funding sources are potentially available to you, right? Like if you don't have the metrics and the numbers, probably not going to VC is a bad option, right? Or if you're not hitting numbers high enough that they get interested, that's also another signal. Maybe that's not the right choice for you, right? If you're very early stage, you're talking about ideas, napkins, but you got a really strong team that can really go out and execute on this, right? You found a customer who's super excited, even though they haven't purchased anything because you literally haven't built anything yet. There might be someone who's willing to support because that framework, that foundation seems to be there. Do you think that that's kind of an accurate assessment of kind of those two areas?
Yeah, I think that's a good description.
And I think, but there are some interesting things, right? Like, for folks who might not be clued in, like those are particularly options, right? If you're an outsider looking in, right? SBIR doesn't really help you because that's kind of going in a different direction. You really have to be within that community, within that system to learn, right? Friends and family, you got to be connected, so if you're networkless, that's kind of a hard way. I mean, I think like the traditional areas of like, if you have such a high conviction, bank loans exist, going out, finding someone who's not high net worth, right? And it's all about the network, right? I think that's kind of something as we've been discussing about this, the network becomes such the important thing, the realistic thing. I think I was just scribbling down some notes and I wrote network and circled it, right? I feel like that's such an amazing investment that someone can make. I think something that's been kind of your superpower, Beal, just like talking with you over the years since I work at Techstars and since forever, network has been one of your strong suits. I'd love to hear, kind of your thoughts about networking and the ability to pull people within your tent, within your sphere, and how that contributes to fundraising.
Maybe a good way to describe it would be if you probably remember from the time at Techstars, the old motto, the give first motto. But I feel like that's a big part of building a network. You want to be a contributor. So whatever that network is, you want to primarily be trying to add value, help others, and the rest will kind of fall into place. I think building a network is a long-term project, and it's probably the best way to describe it is something like a garden. You kind of tend to it, you take care of it, you make introductions here, you help people with this, you share some insight here and there. And, over time, you build those connections both kind of in depth and in breadth. And when it comes to fundraising, things like warm intros really are pretty important. A lot of the time you do cold outreach to an angel or a VC, they're just not going to reply. And so warm intros are important, but everybody's using a bit of their social capital every time they make a introduction for you like that. And so, having cultivated those relationships over time definitely helps with making the connections and getting the introductions both to investors and customers that you're going to need to succeed.
When do you think for a lot of early stage founders, when should they first reach out to investors? I think a lot of people, myself included, we're kind of like scared, right, to initially reach out to people, right? You want to make sure that the first impression is perfectly right and, the deck looks perfect, the numbers look amazing, all that type of stuff. But, sometimes it feels like maybe it's going a little bit too much. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Two things there, and I think that what you said is right. Both with the communications and the materials you're going to share with investors, I would say less is more. You don't really want to send a deck that has every single detail about everything because it tends to be overwhelming. And really, in a lot of those interactions, you're just trying to get to the next step with the investor. You're trying to get to the next meeting. You're trying to get to the next meeting with the next partner. And I've just found that if you look at George, I'm trying to remember the guy's name. Is it George Kawasaki? He has a template pitch, but it's a really simple, large font. But I've just found going with kind of a simplistic, less is more type of pitch in terms of materials and things like that is good. Communications and deck materials, but I would make sure they're very buttoned up. I'd make sure that you use outside figures and that it's very clean and streamlined. But I'd say less is more. Go for elegant design, but don't cram your slides. With that said, I wouldn't get over intimidated with it because it doesn't do you any good if your materials are perfect and you still haven't reached out to the investors, because at the end of the day, the sooner you get in touch, the sooner you can potentially close some fundraising from that person. So that's a piece. I think people get too focused on rounds and they kind of forget that you don't have to do a quote unquote round to raise money. People raise money at investors for different things at different points in time all the time, especially in traditional finance. People do things like private placement memorandums and things like that, but people raise money for different things at different times all the time. And so while you don't want to have, a gazillion pre-seed rounds, and we've seen a trend in that there's like kind of pre-seed and pre-seed and seed part one and seed part two, and you don't want to get too crazy, and you probably do want to somewhat stick to like your larger amounts, sticking to kind of those like more formal amounts. There's no reason you can't raise smaller dollars in between, and you don't have to call it anything. You can just you could call it a bridge round. You could just say what you want, but there's plenty of angels that are interested in doing things like probably $25,000 to $100,000 investments, for really pointed kind of specific purposes. And so you can try to raise that at any time. And I've found a lot of angels that are open to doing those types of investments. And that's not the right amount of money at every point. But if you're just going to take, 25 or 50,000 and plunge that all into product development or something like that, it can help you make some big progress with the product. And I think really what's going to lead to success with the investors is your follow-up. A lot of the time they're not going to invest at the first meeting, and it's really going to be on the quality of your follow-up that's going to determine whether or not they want to invest.
I think that, maybe even going back to like the earliest point of like a startup, right? When you're, thinking about flipping it into like a serious project and you're doing your customer discovery, you're talking to people, seeing what shakes out, what works, what doesn't, you're throwing stuff against the wall, all those different types of things, right? I wanted to get your take on, when you start thinking about like knowing when to hold and know when to fold, right? Like when you make an evaluation that this is something worth going for, or hey, it's probably best if we cut this as early as possible. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, great question. Around the time we started the company, to be honest, I really was not interested in starting a company. I'd already had one of my own companies in the past, and I'd been part of another startup previously. So I knew kind of the stress and the work and everything involved in it. And I wasn't really sure if I wanted to sign myself up for that again. At that time, it was right after Techstars, and I was more interested in trying to break into venture capital or doing something with accelerators. But I started talking with my co-founder, Ben, who had just finished up his PhD at MIT. And so he was seeing some opportunities in the automotive market. I kind of understood them from the business standpoint, just from working in the industry and my time at GM. And I didn't really get the technical side. Didn't know much about human factors or user interface, user experience. But the more I learned about the ideas he had for some technologies and different kind of product offerings that we might build to sell into the market, kind of the more enamored and more interested I got. And at some point, I think I just hit critical mass and said, okay, this is a interesting enough opportunity. It looks profitable. The timing looks right. And we have a shot at building something that can be best in class. So I think for me, as someone who's not doing kind of their first startup, but a little bit farther down the road and probably only want to engage on something that has some real potential, it's those kind of things. Are you passionate about it? Can you wake up every day and be excited about it? Do you like learning about that technical area, if it's a technical type of startup? And do you have the wherewithal to stick with it for at least 2 to 4 years to get it to go? Those were the kind of things that I was thinking about. But if you can build something that isn't guaranteed to have huge success, but at least has the potential to, and the timing seems right, then, maybe those are good considerations for whether to move forward. Also, do you have the right team? So, and between Ben and I, Ben was and still is a world-class scientist with a lot of unique knowledge about kind of the problem area we were trying to solve in user interface design. And I was not really technical in those areas, but I was experienced in business strategy from automotive. So yeah, I thought we had good team, kind of right offering, right time, right market. So we went for it. In terms of the reverse question, when do you go forward? When do you throw in the hat? That's a really tough one. And I'd say your mindset on that probably varies more the fewer people you've got on your team. If you have a bigger team, you have a little bit more of a group momentum that just kind of keeps things going. But when there's fewer people, the momentum of the company and the direction of the company varies more with kind of the way you're thinking and the way you're feeling kind of from day to day. I think especially when you get a little bit farther along, you just have to keep re-signing your own contract with the company. And so for myself, I don't look, 3 years into the future. I'm usually looking more in like 6 to 18 month increments. And so for me to continue, I've just kind of re-signed my own contract, just kind of figuratively, not literally. But I'd say, okay, what's a compelling set of milestones that if I can achieve them in the next 6 months or the next 12 months, that I'd keep going. So I'd say, okay, if I can do X, Y, and Z, like this is compelling, this gets me excited, this makes me believe that this can go all the way. And so probably the last year or 18 months, that's pretty much what I do. I've kept hitting my milestones, and so I've kept moving forward. And until you raise some really serious money, especially if you're building a very technical product that needs a fairly large team, until you raise, your first $2, $3, $5 million round, that's kind of how it goes, and until you have that kind of money, especially if you're doing something in software where you have, a single engineer might cost you $200,000 a year. You just have to kind of keep building things, see where you're at, see what traction you can get with customers, and just kind of go from there.
I think one of the things I really keyed in on when you were talking about that is like the momentum, right? And how, it just needs to feel like a snowball just going downhill, building up, because really that's, kind of how it works, right? You just got to go with it, got to keep building, right? And if it stays and it becomes stagnant and you feel like you're in a rut, right? You can't push the snowball anymore, right? Then it's going to melt, it's going to go away.
Yep.
And I think that that's just kind of some of the natural progressions of the startup world. And
I mean, touching on that, that's a really great point. A few things there. So yeah, momentum is really key. There's a angel investor who's part of New World Angels in Florida named Ron Taro, and I was meeting with him last year, but one of the things he said is momentum is everything. And, he's probably not the first person to say that, but coming from him, it really stuck in my mind. And I let him know that the other day when I talked to him, that was kind of my clarion call the last 6 months to a year. So yeah, momentum is really important. In general with a startup, momentum ebbs and flows, but whatever you can do to build momentum, it makes your work easier. And it ties into that old kind of startup value of focus. And you hear that a lot, especially in the early stages, and it can get a little bit repetitive and even annoying to always be hearing about focus from investors, but it really is key. And especially as things get more complicated, we, as a company, we've done things in some different areas. And, as you grow in sophistication, you're doing more things, you have more product under development, as you're developing, by nature, the organization gets more complex, the nature of the work you're doing gets more complex. And if you have a small team, there's just too many moving parts and it becomes unmanageable, and you get stuck in a situation where every time you grow and you're on the cusp of breakout success, things get unmanageable because there's too much, it's too unfocused. And so you have to get really good at cutting off even good opportunities. Ben calls it killing your darlings, but you might have 5 really great opportunities or things going for you, but the more you can keep whittling away at different aspects of the work you're doing or the products you're building or the customers you're serving, and really look for what is the most impactful product we can build, what is the most single impactful customer that we can work with. That's going to really help with your momentum, because then your efforts, your readings, your learnings, your relationships are all really focused in this one place, and they'll get deep rather than broad. And that's what you want. You don't want to be broad early. You want to be deep. And a way I think about it, or this is kind of an analogy that I find helpful as a visualization. If you know how lasers work, you kind of have these photons that bounce back and forth in the thing with a certain amount of resonance. And when they blast out, they've got all this power to go long distances and even to just kind of burn their way through anything in their path. And so that's what I feel like the power of focus is like, is it's really like a high power laser, and you just kind of obliterate any problems in your path. Whereas if you're aiming your laser at 20 different targets, you might hit the 20 targets, but they're all going to be kind of weak without much force. So yeah, focus, momentum, really key.
All right, I can hear the Air Force really quickly scribbling notes in the background. So that's really awesome. Or the Navy, since they actually have one on their ship, one of their ships. I think a really great question to kind of end off this awesome episode and really this awesome discussion with you. You've been a part of a lot of different accelerators. You actually worked as a coworker with me at Techstars. I really think, the big thing for me, sometimes some of the top-notch accelerators can be really rich in terms of the equity that you're giving up and some of the deal terms that they have, right? It feels sometimes, like a lot, right? But I kind of think about it in a way of like, if I didn't go to this accelerator, right? Or if this accelerator wasn't here, would my business actually be off the ground? Would it actually be better for it? If it didn't work out, if the business doesn't work out at all, period, right? Then it doesn't matter if I gave, 6%, which is the Techstars rate, or whatever the YC rate is, or so on and so forth. So, given that you've gone to a bunch of different accelerators, some that have taken, who have offered investments, and, another one that was, I think, prize-based, right, and not equity-based. Love to hear kind of your thoughts, your experience going through accelerators and having worked for one.
In general, I'm a fan of accelerators. It's not always a good choice to go through them because sometimes they can be so time intensive that they really detract from doing some of the core functions. So like if you're in the middle of product development, that may end up on the back burner if you're going through an accelerator. The paradox with a lot of the startup accelerators, especially the top tier ones like Techstars and Y Combinator and accelerators like that, is they tend to not accept you until you don't really need them. It's like kind of at the point where you're qualified to get in. Like you said, it's kind of you're kind of giving up a lot of equity to get in at a point where maybe you could get the same money on better terms just through a raise. But with that said, I have seen some companies go through the major accelerators where at the time they went in, they were fairly mature, and the terms on which they raised money from the accelerators was maybe a little bit skewed in favor of the accelerator. Some of those have still gone on to be wildly successful, and it really was because they were mature. So I don't know. There's accelerators that are more geared towards kind of pre-product or early stages. I think those are more helpful for people that really don't have any experience at all in the startup world, because they're going to be newer to that. You and I had more of a background in that. So when I started this company, I already had quite a bit of startup background. And so a lot of things that I was taught going through accelerators were things that I was already pretty familiar with. But I think companies have to make their own determination whether it's a good trade-off or not in terms of the money for the equity. But let's say you're a company with a mature product and you go through a Techstars or Y Combinator. That's probably not a bad choice, because you're going to be able to capitalize on that in terms of customers, in terms of additional capital if you want it. And the thing that founders don't quite get sometimes when they go through an accelerator is the majority of that momentum and opportunity. It's really kind of a limited time opportunity. You're going through the program, you're getting all this attention, you're getting all these meetings, and it's easy to feel like that's going to continue at the same level after the program. And in general, it doesn't. You still have some momentum coming out of the program. You'll still have follow-up meetings, but the intensity and all the kind of potentially beneficial things going on during the accelerator, it's really a limited time thing. And so your ability to execute on those and convert them into either paying customers or investors that actually invest, that's really key. And so if a company is in that position going through, that's going to be ideal. A lot of sole founders, they go through the accelerators and they're so busy running from one thing to the other that while they might be kind of checking the boxes, they're not really able to do the proper follow-up or execute on the things needed to convert those. And so you might have hundreds of meetings, but you may not convert them into either people who invest or paying customers. And that's kind of a loss if you do that.
That's awesome. That's awesome advice. I think for me and you, right, we came from the Techstar space. We have a certain level of understanding. There's so many different varieties. I think there's a lot of different accelerators popping up, right? So I think, being able to evaluate it, I see it like evaluating a university, right? A college that you might want to go to, right? And in some cases, I might argue that, only going to the top Ivy League of Ivy League schools is really worth the ROI in some particular cases, right? So unfortunately, have to put a lid on that. We've had a really awesome, great, varied pieces of conversation with you, Adam. Thank you so much. Learned so much about fundraising, about, startup at the early stages. Love to give you an opportunity to kind of shout out anything that you've got going on, how people can reach out to you, how can people help you out at Awayr.ai.
Yeah, thanks, George. It's been great joining you. We are currently fundraising and we're building products for space. We've got some things we're doing in anti-spearfishing and automotive design. So if folks have interest in those areas and they want to talk about partnerships and collaboration, things along those lines, they can reach us at awarai.com or can always shoot us a message on LinkedIn.